I'd like to thank the honourable member for his remarks, and I'm eager to work with him on committee when these issues are discussed. An investigation with young people show that half of people aged 18 to 24 weren't aware of any way of voting apart from the polling station on election day, Mr. Speaker. So what that means is that, in fact, 1 out of every 2 young people, and many of these people are working, going to school at the same time, aren't aware of opportunities that are available to vote before Election Day. Now, why doesn't the member support the measure that we're proposing, which would require Elections Canada to provide additional information on methods for voting to all Canadians?
The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's not an issue regarding the changes to Section 18. As it is formulated at present, as something that we need to consider as part of the mandate for public education. So it's not a black and white issue of one or the other. And I'm not saying that what the minister is presenting as a means of informing young people, I'm not saying that that's not a good measure. The problem is with an exclusion for the rest of the mandate.
Questions and comments. The honourable member, l'honorable député de
The honourable member, not for Laurenti-Labelle, but for Votre Excellence. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Spending limits on fundraising activities. We know that this type of activity often includes negative messaging, political messaging, particularly from this Conservative Party. We know that this kind of messaging actually turns off voters, Speaker. And to quote a Conference Board report on voter turnout, it says it concluded that without fundamental changes in the way in which politics is conducted in Canada, the goals of getting more youth to turn out, are goals that could remain well out of reach for some time. So my question to my honourable colleague would be, would he conclude the same as I have, that this act will only serve to suppress the youth vote and not take a larger youth voter turnout?
The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
I would agree that I think in the result, although who can predict these kinds of things with any certainty, that in the result youth will be detrimentally affected to the extent that they are amongst the sectors of our population that most benefit from the voter ID experiment, pilot project, and vouching. I will give one thing to the minister, although I'm not at all clear this is intentional in the Act because it's so indirectly worded. But if it turns out to be true that the Act actually allows for e-registration of voters and going online to then change your address and everything else, something the Chief Electoral Officer has asked for, there is a provision in the bill that seems to suggest that whatever the Chief Electoral Officer deems as an adequate signature for purposes of registration is sufficient. If that is meant to include electronic registration, then that would be a countervailing factor that I would give to the minister as something that might actually help if it were messaged to youth as a means to register.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for his comments. He talked a couple of items he talked about was with respect to the minister's comments with respect to not wearing a team jersey. And one of the aspects of the bill, and I'll just read here, says appointees who hold the position, we're talking about election commissioner, will hold it for a non-renewable 7-year term and to maintain the integrity of the position. Those individuals who have previously been a candidate, an employee of a registered party, exempt staff of a minister or a staff member of a member of Parliament, an employee of Elections Canada would not be eligible for the appointment of to commissioner. I wonder if the honourable member first question would agree that those individuals who have previously been identified as being partisan shouldn't be holding a position where they would, in essence, then be passing judgment on candidates and, in particular, also members of Parliament who do hold partisan positions. And the second question, just a little bit further on the vouching, he talked about a couple of situations where, where vouching was a good thing. But there are many situations, especially those of us in urban areas, where we have seen the problem with vouching, and where our official agents or the scrutineers that we have in the polls aren't able to challenge people who are being vouched for, who we know are not eligible to vote. I can give the member a specific example. In 2006, scrutineering at a poll, I was shocked to learn that my mother had voted. She had actually passed away in 2005, and when I asked the person how come her name was checked off the list, she assured me that my mother had been in earlier to vote that day. When I explained to her that that was not possible, I was ushered out of the polling station. So for every good, there's always a bad, and I think the integrity of elections are always something that are paramount in any decision that we make going forward. So I wonder if you can comment on those two things.
Toronto-Danforth.
Well, I think it's important to, again, return to some of the wisdom that's in the Supreme Court of Canada's judgment in the case involving Etobicoke Centre, where they said we have to be extremely careful about disenfranchising voters, especially in the name of procedural irregularities. In fact, it obviously benefited in a fair way one of our colleagues in this House, that rationale, that reasoning, because he quite obviously kept his seat for the reasons the court gave. And so I would simply say that individual anecdotes like that, if there was evidence of a scientific sort or even a more generalized anecdotal set of evidence that this is a serious problem, then that has to be, I think, presented at committee so we actually understand. Right at the moment, we are looking at rampant anecdote that seems not to correspond to the sense of people in the system. I would also say that my colleague, the Democratic Reform Critic, for the Liberal Party, did ask a straightforward and important question about whether or not reworking, trying to figure out better ways to vouch would not be better than to use a worn-out cliche, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise to ask my colleagues some questions on this file. The minister suggested that that 25% of those being vouched for were in fact wrong, that there was something wrong about them, when in fact the Neufeld report doesn't say that anywhere. In fact, the Neufeld report suggests widening the use of the voter information card as a valid piece of address information, and yet the government has ignored that part of the report and is now suggesting to eliminate the use of the voter registration card. And so the whole notion of vouching allows 120,000 people who might not otherwise be able to vote. And the government would like to remove that. But this report did not ever recommend it. Could you comment, please?
The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Well, it's an important piece of information that goes back to what I said is going to be important at committee. We have to get down to the level of evidence. The minister, I will concede, is very good at presenting the case as he understands it. But we have to make sure that it's grounded in evidence of the kind that would justify infringing on a constitutional right, which is the right to vote, which drove the Supreme Court's reasoning in the Etobicoke Centre case.
Some comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to commend the minister and the critics today for the quality of the debate. I have a question about a potential gap in the legislation. I understand that there will be penalties now for impersonating elections officials, but in my case, in the last election, somebody impersonated my campaign manager and sent a voter across town to an incorrect polling place. And I'm wondering if that penalty for impersonating election officers could be extended to cover that case where somebody actually impersonated my campaign manager.
Honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Very interesting example. Again, another important anecdote. The life of a society, I guess, is built up with anecdotes like that. But I think the important answer is you do not need to amend the Act to catch that. There are already at least two provisions in the Canada Elections Act that deals with the criminal illegality of trying to divert people from voting. And so the fact of adding the impersonation offense is a matter of adding specificity to something that's already there in generality. And this is also what my colleague, the Leader of the Opposition, was getting at with his questions and question period today. Making sure that the government side understands that nothing in this Act in terms of newly framed crimes means that the existing Act doesn't already cover the kind of behaviour that has been cited by my colleague.